Well, we're back in the basement, and we've been doing a lot of squash videos lately, a lot of squash content. But we really haven't answered the question, which is, I guess, an important one, is how much squash should you grow, or how much squash is enough to feed yourself for a year? So we're going to try to answer that question. So the reason we are in the basement right now is because we were doing some inspecting of our squash, and you can see we've got quite a bit of these Canada crookneck squash out on the freezers right now. They are starting to get to that point, which is actually not that bad. These have been stored since basically October down here because we brought them in when we got our first frost. So they've been in here for quite a while, and things just don't last forever. As you can see, we had these bottom shelves loaded with squash, and there's a few still there that we've basically sorted it already, and the better ones have been left. So we're going to try to keep them for sort of quote-unquote fresh eating as long as we possibly can. And one thing we have certainly found, or learned I suppose, is that some areas of the basement are a little better for storing it than others. So even though there are a couple in here that will need to be basically utilized sooner than later, these ones are quite a bit up off the ground, and they fared a lot better. Essentially, warm air rises and cold air kind of falls, so those shelves you saw before that were on the bottom close to the ground may have been a little bit too cold. I guess what we haven't really done yet with the squash, we've kind of gone through a lot of really positives and excellent points on why you should grow it and what you can do with it, whether it's, and we still have more coming on recipes and that sort of thing. But kind of as a bit of a recap here, in 2021, we brought into the house 442 pounds of winter squash. So that was the green striped Kershaw squash, the Canada crookneck squash, and our big blue squashes. We also did bring in 78 pounds of summer squash. We've utilized that for a lot, and we'll probably do another video on that. We have prolonged that harvest by freezing quite a bit of it, and we have canned a lot. We've canned it into various kind of pre-made meal. But the bulk of the winter squashes, so those other three types that we brought into the house, for the most part has been just stored on the shelves. And of course that's a huge plus. As we get to March and we're sort of 4 going on 5 months of storage here, that's not unexpected that by this point some of these squash are starting to get to that point where we've got to do some further processing if we're going to keep them. In a previous video on squash, we did talk about using it as livestock feed, and we definitely see some real strong potential with a little bit of the sort of trials we've been doing. But what we wanted to talk about in this video is what's a good starting point. So after going through this whole year, what do we think, based on our experiences, is a good place to start? After doing some research, one thing that we did kind of come across was that an average adult could eat about a half a pound of squash per person per meal. So kind of using that as a starting point, we've kind of worked that out to, if you ate one meal a week for a family of 4, that would be 2 pounds of squash. So if you times that by 6 months, and I think that's fairly reasonable, and I'll go into that in a minute, but if you times that by 6 months, that's 75 pounds of squash for one meal. 2 meals, that's 4 pounds per meal, so 150 pounds. 3 meals is 6 pounds per meal, so that's 225 pounds, and just kind of, logarithmically goes up from there. So we picked the 6 months because, to be honest, when you have other items to eat, we feel for the most part, the winter squash, I should say, is probably going to be a real big part of your diet for those 6 months. Now, there are ways to extend that, absolutely, and we are going to do some videos on that. We figure that's a really good starting point because that 6 months is sort of assuming you don't have to do a lot of extra processing. Now, we will say, out of our 442 pounds of winter squash, we didn't start really eating it until kind of later part of December. We did have some meals, but we were still eating out of the garden and some things that don't have the same shelf life. So we've really been eating, on average, we figure about 4 meals of squash a week for kind of the last 10 weeks. So the month of January, February, and the first part of March. which is a lot of squash. And in some meals, we probably are eating more than that half a pound per person. But it's really hard to track that. We track a lot, but that's quite hard to track. When we basically look at what's left in our storage cellar here for the squash, we would say, although we don't have an exact number, we would say we're probably getting close to the 2/3 of the squash having been eaten. And most of that, outside of peels and skins, has been by us. Even though we did show feeding cubed up squash to the sheep, we really haven't fed any large volume of that to them yet. That might change here as we're trying to get through some of the squash, but after going through all this, we would probably recommend a good starting point for anybody who knows that they like squash but maybe hasn't grown it on a bigger scale, is probably aiming for at least 250 pounds of squash, which is about half of what, if for a family of 4, which is about half of what we grew. That's still a lot of squash. So all that being said, if you were to eat 2 meals a week for sort of 6 months, we would recommend sort of a minimum of about 150 pounds of squash for a family of 4. Now, I don't think it's unreasonable to up that significantly to go to even 250, so by an extra 100 pounds, because one thing about squash, even though this big blue squash here is a really long keeper, they don't all have the same shelf life. So even though they're great producers, if you don't have livestock that will eat some of it, you will end up with some waste, because as we've shown, they don't all keep as well as this particular specimen here. Essentially, when you start looking at the numbers, the 442 pounds of winter squash that we grew in 2021 is a little bit more than what we would consume without really pushing ourselves as a family of 4. And there's a few reasons for that. The principal one is because we grow other foods. So we have a fairly large amount of potatoes, beets, and sweet potatoes that we've also grown and have stored. Those have a bit better shelf life than the squash without having to do any extra processing. And although we have been eating them and working our way through them, because obviously this is kind of the one big point to keep in mind, humans like variety. So eating squash or potatoes or anything every day for the whole winter gets a little boring, if you know what I mean. So that variety that we have is a big reason why we probably wouldn't go any higher. Ideally for us, we're probably going to be around the 300 pound, maybe 350. So we're about 100 to 150 pounds over what we probably would reasonably consume on the squash front. But that being said, we're actually going to grow likely a lot more for the reasons of being able to use this as a livestock feed. And that's where it gets a little bit murky, because when we're seriously thinking of basically doubling the amount of squash that we grow. So going from 450 pounds to over 800 is what we'd kind of like, because that would basically allow us to produce a lot of feed for our livestock relatively simply. And as we've shown, we can store that well into the winter months and kind of the onset of spring, which is awesome. But it also makes it a little bit murky, because what will end up happening as we work our way through the squash, we will end up sort of similar to what we showed in the one video on feeding it, on using it as livestock food. We may take certain pieces of the squash and essentially put them aside for the daily feeding, while taking other pieces for ourselves. And so it's going to get hard to track precisely how much went to human food versus animal food. So Stephanie here is preparing us a nice meal of Canada crookneck squash. This is kind of a good example of the point I'm kind of getting at here. We have the neck, which I'm going to say it, on this particular variety, the neck is the most desirable piece, because it's the easiest to make into the vast variety of things that you might do with it. Now, that doesn't mean that the seed end is not edible. In fact, this larger squash is actually quite a nice seed end, and we probably will convert that into human food of some kind.
That's what I'm doing
but
right now.
Exactly, and you're also saving seeds, which is awesome. So we've got like the whole
This
operation.
is for the chickens.
Chickens.
That's for us for seeds.
Us for seeds for replanting.
And bunnies.
Rabbit food. Our food. And so this is where it gets a little bit tough, because these large fruits, one fruit is feeding a lot more than just us. So as per usual, this video may not give you all the answers, but hopefully it kind of shows some of the considerations that we've put into it, some things maybe you should think about on your own homestead or garden, or when you're growing your own food. And of course, you know, we have the set squashes that we like to grow. If we change that up a little bit, that could change how much we grow. In the case of the Canada crookneck, that's a huge, huge component of our squash storage and what we grew in 2021, and it's likely going to continue to be that basically for the indefinite future as far as we can see. But we really haven't got into, you know, how many plants you should plant, how much space you should allocate, all these kind of things, because there's a lot to that. What I hope you can take away from this is they're still very useful, and they produce a lot. Basically, they produce more than most of us would probably like to eat in a given week. And that's okay, because a lot of us have animals that we can also divert that to, even composting parts of the peels and stuff if you didn't have things like rabbits. It is a good idea probably to have a little bit more in storage than you actually want. Because no matter what you do, you will have a percentage that they just don't keep as long as you'd like to, no matter how fast you're burning through it. It's also one of those things where we can delay having to do the extra processing until later in the year. So we're in March. There's nothing to harvest as far as vegetables go. We're not making tomato products. We're not growing anything yet for the most part. So this is a great time of year to take those squash that are just starting to get to that point and process them into something that you could keep longer, whether it's freezing or canning or both. And there's also some other things that we'd like to experiment with. We're not really accounting for the seeds. Now, we have talked about that as far as livestock feed goes, but that's a human food too, which can be diverted into other, making breads or just eating as squash seeds or pumpkin seeds. There's also the potential, and this is something that we need to do some research on, but we had a viewer recently remind us, because we had heard about it, we just hadn't really explored it too much, that there are potentially some other uses, like trying to figure out making squash flour. If we can do that, we can make it go that much further. And I think the take-home message for us is this is still a massive component of our yearly food production from the vegetable side of it, and there's so many things we can do with it. So anyways, on that note, that's kind of our, thoughts on how much squash to consider growing. Obviously, that's going to depend on your situation and that sort of thing, but we also promise that we've kind of bombarded all of you as our viewers with squash videos in the last little while. So this will be the last one until, aside from recipes and that sort of thing, what to do with your squash. But this will be kind of the last video sort of praising squash for all its wonderfulness. So stay tuned for some content in the more distant future when we actually get around to, or when it's the right time to get planting some of this out, and we get into our 2022 production season.